take just a couple seconds to kind of give you my spin on this Amendment 1 thing. I know Larry's going to give us some of the more detailed facts about it, and he's generally not biased, which is good for a public figure, but I am very biased about this thing because I'm an appraiser and a real estate broker, so I'm real concerned about property rights. And I have shown everybody in here this map before. It sits on the back table. This is the Agenda 21 map that shows the areas that are going to be off limits to humans. Okay, so we're getting attacked from that direction. Now, as Andy mentioned, in the state of Florida, 1/3 of the land is already owned by government, federal, state, or local. I don't really think the government needs to be buying any more land. But just to kind of bring it home, the county budget that we've been hearing talk about, part of the millage is set aside for Lake County to keep buying more land here in Lake County. So they're going to be buying that land. If Amendment 1 goes through, the state of Florida is going to be buying more land. And have you heard about the latest scam the EPA tried to pull over on everybody with the water in the state, in the country? Fortunately, the House of Representatives voted 262 to 152 to stop this at the time being. But the EPA had decided that they were going to designate U.S. waters. In other words, what they are going to be in control of. I got a hold of just today, this is what the EPA wanted to take over in Florida. All those colored areas. As you can see, that's pretty much the whole state of Florida. This even includes ditches and canals and land that's only sometimes water. And that map doesn't include wetlands. If you add wetlands into the picture, you'll see there's not much left for people to live or do anything with. And so, and just in case you say, okay, well, how does that affect us locally? If you go to the Lake County Comprehensive Land Use Plan, which I've showed you guys before, the maps are already in here, what Lake County's planning to do. This map is what they already consider to be wetlands here in Lake County. Yeah, the county put the pages in upside down and right side up. Not me. And this map is what Lake County's already designated as conservation lands. So as you can see, I'm not sure where we're all going to live. But, you know, I'm sure you've heard pack them and stack them. That's how we're going to live, and pack them and stack them and whatever. So that's just my take on another reason why we should get Amendment 1 voted down to keep this intrusion from stopping. Now on to the real business at hand. Let me tell you about Larry real quick. Larry Metz. They put your age in here. I don't know why.
You would like to skip that and just go ahead. Skip all of it.
Well, they didn't send me a very long one this time.
I'm glad.
But anyhow, we all pretty much know Larry. He's a great guy. And one of his degrees is from Florida State, which makes him even better in my book. So, here he is. If you want to see any of these maps, feel free to look at them.
Well, that was really good. Well, I was thinking as Jared was talking about speakers that might get you up out of your seats, and you know, at that event in Mascot, and he's going to get down and I'm going to get up. And the expectations are not going to be met here. So full disclosure. But before I begin on the amendments, I just want to mention to you, I think this Tea Party is now 5.5 years old, am I right? Was it 2009?
Yeah.
And I remember when it first started, we were out on 441 waving placards about the stimulus plan and all the different runaway projects that were going on. So as I think about that, the group is still together. You all are here still 5.5 years later. The principles that I see on that banner there, I was thinking about those principles as I was looking at it, and it could be summarized in one word: freedom. That's what it's all about. Every one of those items there is enshrined in freedom. And these are not new or novel ideas whatsoever. These are the founding principles that made this country the greatest nation on earth. And it strikes me as somewhat unfortunate that we have to engage in a great debate just to keep those principles alive and functioning in our country. You wouldn't think you'd have to debate the fundamental principles upon which the greatest country in the world was founded in order to sustain that. It should be self-sustaining because of its greatness. But there are people that just don't buy into that, and they're becoming more and more influential. So we have to keep groups like this together, expand them, recruit new people for the groups, and hopefully even some younger people that can carry the torch forward, because this is going to be a long-term battle to keep these principles at the forefront of our country. So I just want to say thank you for being part of this group, for hanging in for 5.5 years, and let's not ever give up the good fight. So with that, let me just go to the constitutional amendments. I want to give you my role here today. I don't look at it as me coming in and saying, here's what I think you should do when you go to vote. You all have an individual right to vote. You can make up your own minds. I just want to give you some of my insights into it as I've thought about it, and inform, and then let you decide on how to vote, because I know you'll make the right vote. First of all, our Florida Constitution, there's 4 ways that it can be amended. One of them is the citizen initiative drive that we see 2 of our amendments on November having come out of, where the citizens collect petitions and they have a threshold requirement. It gets reviewed by the Supreme Court. If they meet the number of petitions that they're required to get, they can be on the ballot. So we have Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 that got there that way. Another method is for the legislature to pass a joint resolution by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. And if that happens, then an amendment can be put on the ballot for a vote. And Amendment 3 this November was done that way, and we'll come back to that. And then there are 2 other methods that have to do with commissions that are impaneled every 20 years. One is the Taxation and Budget Reform Commission, which is limited to that type of subject matter. They can propose amendments that would go on the ballot. And then you have the Constitution Revision Commission, which also meets every 20 years, but not on the same 20 years as the other one. And they can propose amendments on any subject for the Florida Constitution. If either of those commissions proposes amendments, then they go on the ballot, and they're all subject to the citizens voting at least 60% of the vote or more to approve. So we have 3 amendments on the ballot in November. Amendment number 1 was by citizen initiative, and it's dealing with the Land Acquisition Trust Fund. And I think you all are probably very familiar with this because I've heard the comments from earlier tonight. But what it, in essence, well, before I even go into what this does, let me just say my way of analyzing amendments is the first thing I want to do is I want to know what is it? Just what is it, without being any more detailed than that. Just what is involved here. And then once I know what it is, then I have 2 filters that I run it through. You can't run it through the filters until you know what it is. That's why I put what it is as number 1. But once I know what it is, then my filters are, number 1, does it belong in the Constitution or not? And if I think it could belong in the Constitution, then I would go to the second filter, which is it good policy? So I could come up with a number of reasons why I wouldn't support an amendment. First of all, if I read it and I can't tell what it is, I stop, because I wouldn't have to get to the second 2 steps if I don't know what it is. If it's poorly drafted or it's confusing or ambiguous, that's the end of it. I would vote against such an amendment. But if I can understand what it is, and typically you can, because the Supreme Court does make sure that these things have clear ballot summaries and the language is at least on its face not totally ambiguous. So if they can reject an amendment if it's not clear, or not properly worded. So usually you'll be able to get past number 1. And then when you get to the issue of does it belong in the Constitution, it becomes somewhat philosophical for me, because I look at the Constitution as a document that provides the fundamental rights, protects fundamental rights, and sets up the fundamental structures of government, processes of government. Sort of like we have at the federal level with our founders having given us a great Republican form of government. So the structures are there, but the actual day-to-day policies are left to the legislature or the Congress in the case of the federal government. So I look at the second question of does it belong in the Constitution rather narrowly. I'm just giving you my inherent bias before we talk about these amendments, to limit it to structure and rights and privileges and not to policies that should be left to the legislative branch. So that's the second analysis. And the third analysis is it good policy? Should we benefit from it? Could we benefit from it? And would it be good to have that policy in effect? So that's kind of how I go through it. So I'm going to be focusing on those types of analytics when I go through this for you very briefly. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on these because I want to leave time for questions. But amendment number 1, in essence what it does is it takes the Land Acquisition Trust Fund and it puts it as a priority for funding under the documentary stamp tax, which already exists. And so by constitutional amendment, what happened if this passes, for 20 years, starting on the effective date next year, at least 33% of the money collected from the doc stamp tax, it's in effect as of 2012, has to be directed to the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, and there it can only be used for the following purposes. And they do start out and say, as provided by law, so the legislature does have some say in this because we have to pass laws to implement these notions here. But as provided by law, it can finance or refinance the acquisition and improvement of land. And I'm going to go through the list because it's very broad and very all-encompassing. Land, water areas, related property interests, including conservation easements, resources for conservation lands, including wetlands, forests, fish and wildlife habitat, wildlife management areas, lands that protect water resources and drinking water sources, lands protecting water quality and quantity of rivers, lakes, streams, spring sheds, and lands providing recharge for groundwater and aquifer systems, the Everglades, beaches and shores, outdoor recreation lands, recreational trails, parks, urban open space, rural landscapes, working farms and ranches, historic or geologic sites, and also management, restoration of natural systems, and the enhancement of public access or recreational enjoyment of conservation lands. So it is very, very broad by its very language. Now it does say, as someone mentioned earlier, that the money can be used to pay debt service on bonds issued. So what you can see with the 20-year horizon in the amendment, it would allow for the Land Acquisition Trust Fund to actually bond the revenue stream that they're projected to get. And by the way, that revenue stream is projected to be $648 million in the first fiscal year, which would be 15-16, starting next July 1, in other words. And it grows to double that, $1.268 billion by the 20th year. So what happens with bonding is, if you have an income stream that is guaranteed and predictable, you can go to the bond market and raise money with that income stream covering the debt service, and you can put out 20-year bonds and get a whole lot of money now and go out on a buying spree or a building spree, if it be the case of, say, a school board who was building schools, for example. But bonding does provide the ability to have more money now and pay it back over time. And someone mentioned what Senator Graham said about the intent and why he likes it. That's really provided for in this provision here. So they also say that you can't commingle the funds from that 33% carve out of the doc stamp tax with the general fund. So the legislature's hands would be tied. This money, if this passes, would have to go into that trust fund and can only be used for those purposes that I mentioned. So that really gives you an overview of what it is. And then the issue then becomes for you to decide, does it belong in the Constitution? Because you could say, okay, well, that's fine and good, but does it belong in the Constitution where it couldn't be changed at all unless you went back to the voters for a 60% up or down vote? That's one of the limitations of putting something in the Constitution. You can't change it easily. So that's something you have to consider. And then, is it good policy? Now, it used to be, before Governor Bob Martinez was elected in 1986, he was the first Republican governor since Reconstruction, if I recall correctly. No, after Claude Kirk II. But he was a Republican elected in 1986, and prior to that time, Governor Martinez proposed Preservation 2000. Prior to that proposal, the way government handled regulatory issues with lands and protecting environmental areas was to regulate it out of the use of the private person. They would handle it through land use regulations, zoning, deny development requests. And people would often find that the government thought their property had value ecologically or environmentally, and it would be regulated out of other uses. And that's why Governor Martinez at that time promoted the idea of buying the property. If government thinks the property is so valuable environmentally or ecologically, then government should buy it if they want to and the owner wants to sell it. So Preservation 2000 was designed with that in mind. It was an inherently Republican idea not to take something or regulate it by taking, but to buy it. And so the notion that government might buy a property with a willing seller and just negotiate a price and buy it and put it in public use is not outrageous. But the issue is, does it belong in the Constitution, or should that be handled by the localities or the state government that want to buy land? Preservation 2000 was done statutorily by the legislature, and it became known as Florida Forever after that. So the legislature could adjust as to economic times. You know, if they decided that some particular property was very valuable, very sensitive, they could earmark the money, go out and buy it, and put it to public use. Or if they found that, you know, education needed funding more than land acquisition that year, they'd shift the money and do that. And so the program was working fine and still is working fine. The issue becomes, do you want to put something like this in the Constitution that puts it on a permanent basis and has no flexibility? That's an issue for you to decide. There are people that think that's a good idea, that they ought to go on a buying spree and buy up all this property and just dedicate the money and keep buying and keep doing that. And if that's where you feel, then this would be something you'd want to support perhaps. But my analysis of it, just giving you my insight, is that I don't think it belongs in the Constitution. I think it belongs with the policymakers that are elected. And if you think that they're going out on a spending spree and buying too much property every year, or authorizing too much purchases of property, the way you handle that is you vote them out of office and put people in who don't do that, just like any other performance issue you have with elected officials. But if this passes and you see government buying up all this land every year, you're not going to be able to hold anybody accountable for it because it will have been put in the Constitution, and that's the law. And every one of us takes an oath to follow the Constitution. And we don't get to pick and choose the portions of it that we think should be followed when we take that oath. So it gets back to that three-step analysis that I use. What is it? Does it belong in the Constitution? And if I can get past those two, then, well, is it good policy? So even if you think it's good policy that government might buy property and not regulate it away from somebody, that's still not enough, because you have to get past the idea, does it belong in the Constitution? So that's kind of where I come out with it. I think you all have a really firm grasp of it already. You didn't really need to hear that, but I wanted to share that with you since I was asked to come in and do that. Amendment number 2 is the medical marijuana issue. Now I have to give you a little bit of insight into my thinking here, because we did pass a bill this year on Charlotte's Web, which is a non-euphoric strain of marijuana that was proposed for use. And I didn't support that bill because I have a personal belief that before you put something out in the public domain for medicinal use, whether it's marijuana for medicinal use or any other prescription or medicine, it ought to be subjected to clinical trials that prove that it works in a way that's safe. And that's what happens with our pharmaceuticals in this country. But we didn't do that with the Charlotte's Web. We were going on the basis that it already does work because of anecdotal evidence received in the legislative process. I wasn't persuaded by that. Others were. I'm not criticizing them for coming out differently than I did. That's why we all vote and count up the votes so we can see what the body's will is. But I wasn't convinced that we should do that in that context. So with that history, I think you can see where I would go with the amendment that puts something even much broader in the Constitution where we can't deal with it. So I want to give you that disclaimer. But the idea behind this, it says use of marijuana for certain medical conditions. And it does provide for the use for medical marijuana for very serious, in some cases, terminal conditions. And you might think, well, what could be wrong with that if somebody's dying of cancer or some other terminal disease and they want to be comforted by the use of marijuana and have their symptoms relieved? Why wouldn't that be okay? And that's even something that I could see in certain circumstances. But what we have here, let's go back through this thing here. It does provide for physicians to be the ones that prescribe it. So that's in the hands of doctors. Let me take a sidebar on that for just a second. Although I really respect physicians, and I can't bring myself to call them by their first name, even when they tell me to, I think they deserve to be called doctor in all cases, and I still do that, and I get called on it by doctors that I know. But I have high regard for physicians. But the Florida Medical Association, who would be the members who would be deciding this, they've come out against this amendment, and there are concerns about it. Look back to 2011 when we had the pill mill problem. Physicians are the ones that have the ability to prescribe Class 3 narcotics. No one else can do that in Florida, not even advanced registered nurse practitioners, although in some states they can, but not in Florida. And yet, with that very severe limitation on that, we had pill mills out of control in Florida. And we've brought that back to reality with a bill that we passed in 2011, but I'm just using that to illustrate that even though we have great respect for physicians, in every barrel there are bad apples, and then we have problems. So I don't think that alone is enough to be comforted, but it is reassuring that at least no one else but physicians could do it. Now, debilitating medical condition is defined in the amendment, and that is a good thing, but look at the definition carefully and you'll see that there are some issues that should reach your attention. It does include cancer, glaucoma, positive status for human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, in other words, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, hepatitis C, and other conditions like Crohn's disease, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. So these are serious conditions, and it might seem okay on the surface that medical marijuana could be used by could be prescribed by a doctor for use by a patient with those conditions. But here's what concerns me the most. Or, it says right here, or other conditions for which a physician believes that the medical use of marijuana would likely outweigh the potential health risks for a patient. Let me read that again. After you get past all of the other things that we all probably could say could justify it, like cancer and those horrible diseases that I mentioned, you have another category that is on an equal plane with those, which is, quote, or other conditions for which a physician believes that the medical use of marijuana would likely outweigh the potential health risks for a patient. So, if a physician believes, and the word reasonably is not even in front of the word believes there, which it is in many other instances of law, I can tell you. Reasonably believes is a term of art in law, because it puts a reasonable man standard as the control on that person's discretion. But that word is not here. So if the physician believes that the medical use of marijuana would likely outweigh the potential health risks for a patient, then it's okay. So that is an exception that I think swallows the rule. And that's just something that's there. It's part of the what. And then you can also apply it to the, does it belong in the Constitution and is a good policy as well. But they do try to have some limitations on who gets it by requiring identification cards for people that are cleared by their doctor. And they have licensing and regulation of the marijuana growers and so forth. And so that would be authorized by law. So they do define who a qualifying patient is, and they have to have an ID card. The physician has to certify. So there's a lot of things in here that seem good on the surface for something like this, but when you go to that exception that I read you, I mean, it's just about anything that someone could convince their doctor to give them a prescription for, as long as the doctor weighs it and believes that, okay, it'll probably help you more than it'll hurt you. That's really what the standard would be. If the doctor believes that it would probably help you or do you more good than harm, then it's okay. That's how I read that. So there's a lot of, language in this. It's very long. Limitations, if it's non-medical use, then nothing would, affect the laws on that. Quite a few things there. You can get these actual amendments off of the Secretary of State website. They have the document. I got it from there. Proposed constitutional amendments, the actual language of the entire amendments there, plus the ballot summary. So there will be regulations needed for this, and that'll cost money, that'll grow government, and the government will have to be involved in regulating and then chasing down the bad actors in order to have this implemented. And there'll be costs associated with that. There's no real estimate here of what that would cost. But when you have a department that's issuing identification cards, and then auditing physicians to make sure the certifications are there, and making sure the growers are handling the production of the products correctly and controlling it and accounting for it, there's going to be a lot of costs associated with that, just like any other government program. So let me move on to number 3, which is one dealing with the prospective appointment of certain judicial vacancies. This one has not gotten a lot of publicity. I had a lot to do with this because this was out of the Senate Judiciary Committee this past session. It was passed out there, or filed there, I should say. Let me go back. The way we do bills in the Florida House and the Florida Senate is there's a deadline, which occurs occurs at the beginning of session. You have to have your bills drafted and filed by noon on the first day of session. So after the bill drafting deadline was over, the Senate Judiciary Chairman called me and said he had this amendment that we're dealing with that he wanted to get help with in my subcommittee, the Civil Justice Subcommittee. And I wanted to help him, but I couldn't because we had no way of getting a bill drafted after the deadline. So I went to the Speaker's office and I said, is there a way we could help with this? Because this issue is something that I think is important. And there was a way we could do with it under our rules, but it would have to be done later in session, and it would have to be done on the floor. We wouldn't be filing a bill, we wouldn't be running it out of the committee, we wouldn't be presenting it to different committees, it would be coming right to the floor after the Senate passed it. And the Speaker basically said, if the Senate passes it by a 2/3 vote and it comes over, can you handle it? And I said, I'd love to. And so he said, well, we'll wait and see what they do. And I told the Judiciary Chairman of the Senate, if you need me, I'm here, but we have to get it out of the Senate first on that 2/3 vote. He said, okay. So they did pass it out of the Senate by a 2/3 vote. It came over to the House. The Speaker called me in and said, it's yours. And I took it and I ran it off the House floor. We had a long debate on it because the Democrats did not want this amendment to be put on the ballot. And so every one of them questioned me, well, not every one of them, but a lot of them questioned me on the floor, and then every one of them voted against it. So let's give you that as background since I was involved in it. So although I'm not the House sponsor, because there is no House sponsor since it wasn't filed in the House, I ran the bill as though I was the sponsor. Now what it does, it simply takes existing language that's dealing with the judiciary, and specifically vacancies in the judiciary at the appellate level, and it clarifies it so that we don't have a problem in the future when we have vacancies on the Supreme Court. By way of history, in 1955 there was a case that was litigated because an incoming governor takes office at noon on Inauguration Day every 4 years. But the terms of the justices of the Supreme Court expire at midnight on Inauguration Day. And also, so for what happened in that case in 1955 was at midnight the judges leave office and the vacancies then are deemed to occur at that moment. When the term expires, the incumbent is out, there's a vacancy, and a new governor doesn't take effect until 12 hours later on Inauguration Day. So an outgoing governor appointed a judge, and then noon occurred and they had an inauguration ceremony, and then the incoming governor appointed a judge to the same vacancy, and they had to litigate that. And so it ended up being resolved by the Supreme Court, but it was determined that there is an ambiguity in the Constitution about that subject. Now, roll it forward to 2000, and I'm not remembering the exact year, but it was about 2006 when the Supreme Court was asked to weigh in on this very issue because we had Governor Jeb Bush leaving office and Governor Lawton Chiles coming in after him. Governor Chiles was leaving office and Governor Bush was coming in. I had that reversed, but it was around 1998, I think this occurred. But regardless of the dates, what had happened was you had a governor changing office, and the two governors, the outgoing and the incoming, got together and said, let's just make sure we agree on whoever gets that open Supreme Court position. And they did. They worked it out. But they had to ask for an advisory opinion. And the Supreme Court came out and said, well, it's ambiguous, but, well, they didn't really say it was ambiguous, but they sort of indicated that if the governor knows there's going to be a vacancy, the Judicial Nominating Commission that considers applications for that vacancy could meet, and they could give him nominations before he leaves office. But it doesn't say they have to. That's the issue. So what this amendment does, currently, the way it's interpreted, they just talk about a vacancy on the court. So that means that the person has left office. That's how they've interpreted the current language without this amendment. That when the person leaves on January 4th or whatever date that is, that's when you have a vacancy. So under current law, the only safe way you can proceed is wait for that justice to retire, or if they're not retained in office, that would be in November, you would know they're leaving and they'd be out of office in January. Or if they decided not to run and they didn't qualify and there was a vacancy because of that. 3 different ways you can get a vacancy, but it wouldn't happen until they actually walked out the door that you would impanel the Judicial Nominating Commission to pick people to nominate for the replacement. So what this does, it just says, it creates a new category called a prospective vacancy. So when you have qualifying in May and someone doesn't qualify because they chose not to or the papers weren't right, and now we know we have a vacancy in January ahead of us, if this amendment was to pass, the Judicial Nominating Commission can go ahead and start meeting and start interviewing applicants and then whittle down the list and give the governor nominees, the governor who's in office, and that governor can then pick somebody and say, okay, it's September 15th or whatever date, October 1st. I'm appointing this person to the Supreme Court, and they'll take office on January 4th when that person leaves office, who's there now. So you can have someone walking out the door and someone coming right in behind them so that there's no break in service. Why this is important, in addition to avoiding litigation between an outgoing governor and an incoming governor, like we had in 1955, but you also avoid the interruption of workflow on the court. And we'll have 3 justices leaving office in January of 2019, when the next governor, whoever's elected in November, whether it's Governor Scott or I can't say his name. I know his name, but I don't want to say it. The other guy, if he's elected, he would be the one that would be in office for that next 4 years. And so you'd have either one of them would be, we don't know who they are, so we don't have to judge this amendment based on that. We judge it on the basis of good policy. But if we don't have this amendment pass and we have ambiguity about the vacancies, what could happen is you'd have 3 justices leaving in January of 2019, and they'll start the process then of interviewing applicants, and you could have a 120-day delay minimum before you would have the replacement appointed. So you could have 4 justices on the Supreme Court doing all the work of the court for 3 months. That is not good for the state of Florida, folks, regardless of who wins the next election. I don't think it is. And so this is why this was good policy, and we embraced it without knowing who's going to make the appointments. And that's the beauty of it. You can debate it in the abstract now because we don't know who the governor will be. But we think it's good policy that regardless of who the governor is, it's clear that the authority's there until they leave office, and we don't want to have interruptions in workflow at our appellate courts. So that's, in essence, what Amendment 3 would do. And it's not very long. If you go on the website, you'll see it's adding a little bit of language to create the prospective vacancy concept clearly in the current law. It doesn't really create any new government or new government powers per se. It just clarifies the process for replacing judges that are outgoing. Once we know that they are outgoing, we can start working on it. If you think about the business sector or the school board or any other organization, when you know you've got a vacancy in a key position, like say for example if they decide that they're going to have a new superintendent at some point in the future, they wouldn't wait for that person who's there now to leave and then start looking for a replacement. They would say, okay, if we know that the superintendent's retiring or whatever, let's get out and advertise it and interview people and have a parallel process like we did when we chose the current superintendent in 2008. We started that search almost a year beforehand. So when we had the transition, we had a new person in place and ready to go. So that's what we're doing here with this amendment, nothing more. So with that, let me take your questions on these amendments or on anything else that might be on your mind. I'm happy to try to answer questions. Yes, sir.
I understand on the Amendment 2 on the marijuana issue that medical marijuana is different from recreational marijuana to the extent that the hallucinatory qualities have been taken out. Is that correct?
That is correct for the Charlotte's Web version of it that we addressed in the bill that was passed in 2014, which I did not vote for that bill, but that is a non-euphoric strain of marijuana known as Charlotte's Web. And my concern was not with that so much as the idea that we didn't have the clinical trials first before we have it out for widespread use.
So what we're actually voting on is the non...
No, sir. I didn't finish, actually. Okay. That was the bill we passed in the legislature that deals with Charlotte's Web. This medical marijuana is the real marijuana that has the euphoric content in it. Yes. It is not limited in the language to the non-euphoric strains that are in Charlotte's Web. This is the full-blown marijuana. Of course, they're going to say it's for medical use, not recreational use, and therefore you need a certification and prescription by a physician, but the actual strain is not the non-euphoric type. But I'm going to come to this lady and then back to you, sir, and then to Norm.
That was part of my question. I Can't hear you.
Can't hear you. Go here, belt it out.
The rest of my question pertaining to the answer to his is in what form is it? Is it in the form that you smoke it, or is it in the form, as I have been told, that it's in the form of a pill or capsule or something?
Cookie.
Well, the bill that we passed in 2014, and again, I didn't vote for it, but it did pass, and it's the law of Florida, is not the type you smoke at all. But on this amendment here, I don't think it's limited to that type of, I don't remember seeing anything limited in that fashion. We go back and look at the language, because to me, that's the key thing. Look at the language and see what it
Because I
says.
think young people think they can get this and smoke it, and I have been told that medically, or take a person in hospice, how are they going to smoke marijuana? It does not seem logical to me.
Well, I don't think the limiting language is in this amendment that was in the bill that we passed. I didn't think it was before I looked, and I didn't see it when I looked just now. The bill that we passed in 2014 is very limited, and it would have to be done like an oil or something like that. You couldn't smoke it. It wasn't intended to be smoked, and it wouldn't provide a high if it was smoked. But this, I don't think, limits it in that fashion, from what I've read on the language and what I've read in other reports. Let me come back to this gentleman and then Norm, and then we'll make our way around. Yes?
Right now,
No, you were next.
okay, the cost of this, when somebody buys it, is it going to be covered by drug companies? Is it going to be covered by the state? Is something that the state's going to pay for?
I have no idea. It's not addressed specifically in the amendment, those types of details on the implementation. But the legislature will have to weigh in on this, and things like that will come up, I'm sure, if this does pass. I mean, obviously there's going to be lots of issues to deal with when you have an amendment this broad that has to be implemented. So I think those are fair questions, but they have to be answered at a later time, depending on whether it passes or not. Norm?
Yes, I want to change the subject in case somebody else wants to talk about marijuana. I want to talk about the First Amendment.
Before we go to that,
okay, we'll
can
go
you
back to
clarify something?
Yes, sir.
Since I understand you to say that you passed another law, Charlotte's Web.
The legislature passed a
I'm
bill
familiar with
dealing
that.
with Charlotte's Web.
What do we need this one for?
Well, that's a good question, because Charlotte's Web is intended to benefit children with seizure disorders.
Yes.
And it's medicinal, and it's only for that limited universe of folks, and there's only going to be 5 distributors, and you have to have a certificate from the Office of Compassionate Use in order to get the prescription. It's very narrowly drawn. And again, my concern with it was mainly the fact that it was being put out there for use without the clinical trials first showing its efficacy. That was my reason for my opposition to it. But yes, that did pass. It was signed by the governor. The rules are now in process for it, and there's a lot of activity in that area. So you could absolutely, people have asked and have concluded in some cases that since that passed, this is not needed, even if they were a supporter of medical marijuana. They're finding that some people have said that that's enough, and they don't think this is needed because of that. I didn't vote for the first one, so I think you know where I stand on the second one. But, yes, Marie?
Well, with the Charlotte's Web legislation, Andy and I were in some of those sessions with the parents with those poor kids with epilepsy, but will people say that have those other horrific ailments that you mentioned in this amendment be covered under Charlotte's Web? For instance, the cancer patient, the multiple
I
sclerosis.
think it goes to some of those conditions in the bill,
Okay.
if I recall correctly. I wasn't on any of the committees that heard the bill. It was in the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. I didn't sit on that committee. But I believe from my recollection of the general floor debate that it was very narrowly drawn in that sense, but it did not limit itself just to the seizure disorders,
Okay.
although that was the primary focus of the hearings where the parents came in. And it was compelling. I mean, I didn't vote lightly against it. Only 7 of us did vote against it in the entire House. But I did it after a reflection on what was going on in the Senate bill, which did not survive. It was the House version that passed. But the Senate bill had the clinical trials first And depending on the results of those clinical trials, then they were going to allow it to be used. But the House said, we're going to go ahead and put it out for use, and we're also going to study it at the same time. And I just think you should study it first, get the results. Does it work? Yes or no? If it works and it will alleviate symptoms for people, then I would be able to support it. In the Charlotte's Web version, I'd be able to support that if I had the data and the facts to back it up. But I wasn't comfortable putting it out for general use without having the clinical trials done first. That's why I voted against it. Yes, sure. Oh, Norm wanted to come back.
I want to talk about that.
Yeah, he wants to go to property, so.
Okay, just a general question. 1 and 2 do not sound to me like they're true amendments to the Constitution. They're not constitutional in nature. So, and I know what your viewpoint on that point of your test, but it seems like anybody can come up with any proposal, say it's an amendment to the Constitution, and there's no criteria. So what, is that amendment or is that a non-amendment? How many amendments do we got to the Constitution that should not be out there?
You could make a very good point, Chair, and that's something that the Constitution Revision Commission, when it convenes in 2018, will probably look at, because we've had not just these amendments, but there's been other ones in the past, like the pregnant pigs one, remember that one, that got a lot of attention, which passed? And so, but here's the thing, the slippery slope that occurs is that if you were to have standards in the Constitution itself for future amendments, and then you have folks collecting petitions, you're going to have a petition access method for amending the Constitution after we go through the next round of revisions, and you have that there, but then you have a standard that has to be met. What you're going to end up doing is having the courts decide on every amendment in a greater degree of discretion than they have now. So it's a trade-off there. If you want to say, well, let's have the courts more powerful on amendments sifting and screening and vetting, give the courts more power, and the people, they can collect petitions all day long, but if they don't meet the standards that they're there according to the court, they don't get to be on the ballot. You've cut off access of the people to amend the Constitution. So, but then the other side of the coin is, if there's open access to amend it by petition drive for any subject at any time for any reason, you get amendments that don't belong in there under our view of how a Constitution should work, and you risk those passing. The one thing that I think helps us is since 2004, I believe it was, the threshold is 60%, and I supported that back then as a way of sort of cutting out some of the closer ones. I think if we're going to change our Constitution and make it a permanent part of our fabric of our state, we should have a very high threshold required for that. So I'm glad we have 60%. That is a saving, redeeming feature to the amendment process. And I personally like the idea that the citizens can rise up and put something in front of themselves to vote on. That's why I've put that in the bill on the North Lake County Hospital District. I thought that the people should be able to vote after decades of paying that tax, whether it's a good idea or not. So it's a trade-off. Okay, who did not? Norm's going back to the property, but number one. Are you going to be on the marijuana one or the other one?
No, just a point of interest. I recently heard that we have amended our Constitution in Florida 120 times in the last 45 years. So that gives you an idea.
That's a lot. Okay, Norm, let's go there.
Larry, thank you so much for being such an excellent representative for us. We're fortunate. I want to ask, my issue, I want you to wear both hats. As a legislator, if you can answer, and as an attorney. My goal is to be punitive to governments and government agencies that are taking lands off the tax rolls. Any way they do it, I don't care. And also to these green, feel-good Sierra groups and things that are buying up land and taking them off the tax rolls. Because every time they take more land, that reduces the amount of land in the state, number one, causing the price to go up. Number two, causing us taxpayers to have to make up for the difference in the tax base that has been removed by these governments and by these groups. Why can't we tax anyone, and I'm talking about the federal, the state, the county, the city, anybody who is taking land for whatever. It needs to be taxed. It needs to be taxed at some rate. And that would be punitive towards these other agencies, because right now there's no reason not to do it. As a matter of fact, I'd like to have a tax rate that would deplete the amount of money that they would be taking in off that bill. And they would be so busy then paying taxes on all they've already taken, they won't be able to buy any more. But if they did buy more, they would make it very careful.
Wishful thinking.
And as a class action suit, as an attorney, could we do a class action suit as taxpayers? Because we're being harmed and damaged by lands being removed from the tax rolls on the one hand, but then on the other hand, as a legislature, we have the House, we have the Senate, and we have the governor. Why can't we do more than we're doing?
Well, Norm, there's a lot wrapped up in that question. I don't think we have any instances that I've been aware of, that's been brought to my attention where there's been extra legal, or in other words, illegal purchases of land. Government has gone out under existing law and bought land for whatever reason they deemed appropriate, and is done under statute. In most cases, this would change that if this passes. So you do have remedies involved in that, and if you think that there's too much land being purchased by someone, then you can, who's in office, whether it's at the county level or the state level or some special district level, you have access to that through your elected officials. In other words, at some point, we have to just say, things aren't going to be exactly the way we think they should be every time, we as voters, you know. And so if that's the case, we have to take that to the election booth and make changes. And if you can't accomplish it there, you might not accomplish it at all. That might be the ultimate place where the buck stops, because it's not realistic, I think, to think that you're going to be able to have, you know, more new taxes created because people want to take property and put it into public use. I mean, I don't see that. I know there was some bill ideas floating around. One said that if before a government could buy a new piece of property, it had to sell an old piece of property.
Yeah, good idea.
But think about that in practice. So, you know, the town of Hadley wants to have a new park on Little Lake Harris. They have to find something to sell before they can buy that, even though the voters in that community have voted to tax themselves to buy a piece of property for a new park. I mean, at some point, the principles can be carried too far and then can restrict freedom. When it might be, in other words, government, people elect their government officials largely in this country. And when they do, they're entitled to get good government, hopefully, but they could get bad government, and they have a remedy for that, which is to run somebody else to replace the bad officials with good ones. So that may be where the problem that you're identifying needs to be solved.
I think though, that the little old lady sitting over here, we do not have a sophisticated election. We have a highly sophisticated governmental machine. And I don't think most people understand the ramifications of most of the things they're voting on or what's going on. Number one. Number two, the county commission, for example, are voting now to increase the taxes, either 18%, and now they've done some favor, reduced it to only 13% increase. But the reason they're doing that is because they need more money. Well, the taxpayers need more money too, but they can't go back to the trough and give themselves a raise anytime they want to. And I just don't think it should be so easy. And I'm talking about the private groups as well. Now we should have a tax on all the land, those especially private groups like Sierra Club and groups like that. We should not have to pick up the tax for those people.
Well, I think when you're talking about non-governmental entities not paying tax, I mean, we have, for example, those who are farming right now that get agricultural exemptions. Well, the idea being that they might need the help if they're going to stay in agriculture because they're going to be making less money than someone who's going to maybe develop the property. And we might have some agriculture in this state. So that's what's been traditionally done in Florida through the tax policies. So, I mean, it's just a matter of philosophical orientation. I mean, if you were saying that the Sierra Club is buying property and getting a tax break, I would like to know more about that, how that works.
I don't think they're paying taxes. I think they're tax exempt.
Yeah.
It depends on the nature of the use of the property. I think property
they
appraisal
finagled through the legislature
has to
the tax exempt status.
determine that, yeah. Well, those can be looked at. Those are statutory changes that can be made on an individual basis. I know, for example, I worked on a bill this year that was trying to increase the ability to get charitable exemptions for churches and other types of institutions that were trying to grow their church or something and be able to get that, if they're taking active steps to grow their church through an acquisition and development of a property, they should be able to get their tax exempt status ahead of the occupancy while they're building it so that they can build it. So there's things we can do in the tax policy like that that can help people. But anyway, but yes, Walter.
If the state of Florida comes in and buys up $20 billion worth of land, has any government accountability office made any kind of estimates of how that's going to affect the tax rolls as far as, because all those properties won't be paying tax anymore? You know, is there anybody that's studied what potential impact that might have tax-wise for the state?
Walter, the honest answer is I don't know if they have or not. I haven't been given anything like that. I get lots of emails and reports sent in my house account. I haven't seen anything on that I can remember seeing lately. Doesn't mean they haven't done it. I'm sure there's been some studies of tax policy, maybe by the James Madison Institute or groups like that, think tanks that might look at that. And I would say, if you're interested in finding out more about whether that has been studied, that would be a really good place to start. Go to the James Madison Institute's website. They have lots of policy briefers and other position papers on their archives there on their website.
Okay.
And I have to think they've looked at that before in general. Yes, Board Member Howard, how you doing, sir?
Very good. On Amendment 1, what is the money earmarked for presently for those dock stamps? Because if Amendment 1 passes and that money's pulled for another use, then obviously you guys are going to have to backfill from the general fund or somewhere else. So what is that money currently being used for?
You know, I don't have an answer for you. You're right, though. Your principle is correct. When you're taking a third of the existing revenue stream, because this Amendment 1 does not create a new tax. It's taking the existing dock stamp tax and just saying whatever's collected from that tax as it existed in January of 2012 has to be put in the Land Acquisition Trust Fund and used in this manner. So you're taking a third of whatever's being used there. I'll try to find out for you and get back to you on that. I haven't, for purposes of tonight, I did not research that to know where it is. It's obviously in the budget somewhere. It's being spent currently, and it would be shifted out to the trust fund. Therefore, it would be a shortfall that either would have to be left as a shortfall or made up somewhere. Again, tying the hands of the legislature in the budget. It's a point well taken. Thank you. Yes, Andy. I don't know how much time. I don't want to take more time than you planned for me.
To answer your question, I've got information from the Department of Revenue that it's affordable housing, economic development, transportation, and a piece of it goes to education. That's the existing dock stamp revenue stream right now. That's what it's being used for today.
Andy, did you get that from a report or a printout or an email?
From the Department of Revenue, yes.
Did you get it in your email? Can you forward it to me?
Yes, yes.
That would be helpful. Thank you for doing that research. Okay. So, can you get that to Board Member Howard? Do you have his email?
Sure, will do.
Okay. That would be good to have. I know there's got to be something there that's worthwhile that it's going to be shifted from. So, yes, sir.
Two questions. First, who are the people that are going to be on this group that are going to buy the land? Who appoints them? How long are they elected for? Appointed for?
The Land Acquisition Trust Fund, I don't think that's covered in the amendment, and I haven't researched that either, to be honest with you.
So a governor could appoint people that do things different than the amendment people wanted, right? They could not buy land if they wanted to. If they appointed people, and my second question is this: if you're taking a third of the money out of what you've already got appropriated, to make up the third, if you use the same thing, you gotta raise that tax by more than the third that you need, because every time you raise it, you're cutting a third of it out and keep building up the other fund. So
it's a revenue shift that has to be made up somehow.
Maybe the thing to do is cut the dock stamp way down and appropriate the money, and then that way they can't get so much money. I mean, right now, it's like when a company pays your income tax when you go overseas. Well, the more they give you to pay your tax, the more tax you owe. And that's what you're doing with this amendment.
I think they've contemplated that by referring to this tax as it existed on January 1st of 2012. However, they put as amended from time to time, or any successor or replacement tax. In any type of amendment like this, and even the statutes too, you can't possibly describe every contingency that could come up, that could avoid litigation, because all you gotta do is look it up and the solution's right there. You're gonna have litigation over this thing if it passes, in my opinion. Whether it's people who think the trustees are not buying enough land, if that's what's happening in their view, or perhaps if the legislature tries to exercise its fiscal responsibilities by shifting the taxation level or the burden, then you could have them saying, well, no, that's not allowed because the amendment says you have to capture it and keep it in that trust fund. I mean, not all the answers are provided, and when they're not provided, inevitably what happens is you end up in litigation where judges decide the issues. And that's not a good situation in general. Again, it's better to have it where, Barbie?
We just gotta vote it down, that's the answer.
Yes, we need all
There you go. I think you
the
know the right answer. But I'm not here to tell you what to do, because I think you know what to do intuitively yourselves. And I just try to provide information to you and help give you a little bit of analytics on how I look at it. But that's not I'm not the all and all, and I have, limitations on my understanding as well, just like everybody does when they read pages and pages of legalese, which is what it really boils down to. But in conclusion, I want to thank you for letting me be here and trying to explain these to you. Keep up the good fight. Don't lose the faith. Let's never. I know there's been people, I've met them, where they're almost to the point where they say they're going to give up. They've had it. They're up to here. They don't want to get involved anymore. They've turned off. A lot of people are turned off by the system, by the government, by what's happening in Washington especially. And we just can't do that. If we give up, we're surrendering to the forces that have brought us together here tonight. And we can't do that ever. So keep up the good work. Keep up the good fight. And let me know how I can be of help to you. If you're my constituents in District 32, please do get in touch with me about those things. Even if you're not, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm always accessible to you, and I look forward to continuing to serve you. So thank you again.